Welcome all to this knowledge share session about the power of audiovisual communications. I'm Steph Bridgeman and I'm a media intelligence consultant, and it is my pleasure to welcome our guest Patrick Fagan, who will be sharing insights today about the behavioural science connected with broadcast media and how audiovisual communications can help in driving organisational outcomes. Now, before I introduce Patrick properly, let me just take a moment to thank eMedia Monitor, who have facilitated today's session. Last year, I started a series of conversations with Thomas, Elizabeth, and Lisa at the wider team at eMedia Monitor about the power of audiovisual storytelling within integrated communications campaigns. And eMedia Monitor specialises in monitoring broadcast communications, that's sound and image, TV and radio, podcast, and YouTube, and providing results and alerts in real time. They offer the most comprehensive broadcast coverage in the industry, and they do this on an international scale for some of the world's leading brands, governments, and corporate entities. They also supply broadcast news monitoring and analytics capabilities to the media monitoring sector and to PR agencies directly. So, we talk a lot in the media intelligence space about integrated communications, but we rarely lean in to explore the idea of broadcast as a thing in and of itself. So I set out to speak to some professionals who can offer perspectives on the power and the value of broadcast. So today we will explore the behavioural science behind connected with broadcast media. And we'll ask how TV, radio, and other forms of broadcast media can be effective in changing hearts, minds, and behaviours. We'll hear about some of the hidden or subliminal tricks that occur on broadcast media to encourage certain outtakes or outcomes. And I'm planning on asking Patrick why people shouldn't watch TV in bed, so stay tuned for that. So first, let me introduce Patrick properly. Patrick is an applied behavioural scientist with 15 years experience turning minds into money for household name brands and major political campaigns around the world. He's a part-time lecturer and has published papers on topics like digital nudging, targeted advertising, and price psychology. He's a Sunday Times best-selling author and a former lead psychologist at Cambridge Analytica. You can find out more about Patrick at patrickfagan.co.uk or connect with him on LinkedIn, where he regularly shares practical tips linked to the psychology behind marketing and communication. So welcome, Patrick. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Hi, Steph. Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to it.
That's good. Well, they say an image is worth 1,000 words, and that's one of the reasons why TV, and in the past 100 years, and particularly more recently with social TV and video, it's been so influential on societies. So can you tell us a little bit more, perhaps, about the power of the moving image in persuading audiences to think or feel a certain way?
Yeah, well, one of the really key things to remember is in our evolutionary history, we've had eyes for a lot longer than we've had language, tens or hundreds of thousands of years longer. And so we just tend to process images in a more automatic and emotional way than we do words. It's called the picture superiority effect, and there's loads of research on this showing that we pay more attention to images, we notice them quicker. Eye tracking research shows that an image is more or less the first thing you look at in a scene, for example, a newspaper article or Google search results. We noticed it first. An image has what's called pre-attentive effects. So an image will have an emotional impact on us before we're even consciously aware of what we're looking at in the image. Images are more memorable, more persuasive, and more believable. And there's also a degree of seeing is believing. So if we see something visual, we tend to believe it. And then that impression, that belief sticks around, even if it's later, quote unquote, debunked or shown not to be true. And then you take video, and that's obviously imagery turned up to 11. That's even more persuasive than static image. For example, there's research showing that videos are better, again, noticed and better remembered than static imagery. We have a hardwired tendency to look at contrast, so to look at movement, essentially. If a ball or a wasp comes towards your face, you'll immediately look at it. So we're hardwired to pay attention, really, to moving images. So anyone with kids who's turned on the TV knows that immediately the kid is entranced, completely kind of hypnotized and fully focused on the TV screen, partly just because of this moving imagery and this moving noise that influences us. And images have 1,000 words, videos have 100,000 words, so to speak. And in that sense, we're just bombarded with sensory information when we're watching a video, particularly modern videos, which have faster cuts, more information crammed in there. You watch the news on CNN, they might have a thing scrolling along the bottom as well as the story itself, and the story is maxed out in terms of how emotionally engaging and sensationalist it can be usually. So we are just bombarded with information, and that overwhelms our ability to think rationally and critically about it, which you can do with text very well. If you read something, you can digest it, you can look out the window and think about it and integrate it with the other memories and experiences and understanding of the world. But being bombarded with information via video, there's no really chance to pause and reflect. And that just makes us more likely to take it on and believe it, because you can't critically deal with it.
So that kind of speaks to the importance in broadcast being an important part of an integrated communications program in order to reach those kind of subliminal spots, perhaps that the printed words otherwise can't. Have you worked with any particular brands specifically and spoken to them about how they can be using a broadcast perhaps more effectively to kind of get to those shortcuts in the brain? Have you got any examples of brands you might have worked with beforehand in relation to broadcast?
Well, I should say, first of all, that print is still very useful. And actually, the more kind of modalities you can reach people through, the better. It's called, for example, dual coding theory. If somebody sees something and hears it, they're more likely to remember it than if they just see it or just hear it. So the more senses you can engage, the more kind of sensory channels you can get to people through, the better. And also reading, as I said, it may be less emotional, but it's more reflective. So you can probably build deeper connections in memory with text, because it's kind of richer in a cognitive sense. People digest it a bit more, I think, because they think about it. And there was a study actually that showed that people who watch TV for their news change their opinions a lot more than people who read newspapers for their news. So TV, audiovisual communication is quite good for engaging people emotionally, changing their minds about things that are kind of superficial and so on, whereas text maybe is better for building long-term, stable kind of beliefs. Um, yes, of course, I've worked with clients before on kind of audiovisual campaigns. I mean, all of them in a way, obviously, are using audiovisual stimuli to some extent. But I would say yes to the big above the line campaigns. They're very effective. You know, there's a lot of talk about nudging and personalized experiences and targeted ads, which I work in and I do with clients, and they do work most of the time. But these are kind of marginal gains, which are good for big companies. But actually, if you're a smaller company, maybe people are less familiar with you, you get a lot more bang for your buck just having one simple message and saying it loudly across these kind of above the line audiovisual channels. So that mass marketing works very well. There's a book, especially for smaller brands where familiarity is low. There's a famous book called The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon, which is a real classic on how to influence the mass of the public. And he said that you shouldn't engage people rationally. What you should do is pick an idea, a statement, say it very loudly and boldly, and just keep saying it again and again and again. And that's the way to persuade people. So in that sense, this kind of audiovisual mass media is very effective.
Yeah, it's a way of layering up that kind of frequency of delivery of a particular message. I remember that's one of the things I first learned when I entered this industry, media intelligence industry. It's about frequency of delivery of a message. We used to use the example of an advert that was frequently on TV here in the UK called Chicken Tonight. I don't know if you remember that
Yeah,
particular
of
one,
course.
but it was, it was about, we all knew about it because we heard it so many times. And I suppose there are elements to which broadcast or appearing on broadcast news, in particular if your client or your organization has appeared and got a story running in print, but then if it also happens to be picked up by broadcast channels and appears
Yeah.
on their broadcast news, particularly if you're listening to radio, it's often that same broadcast news repeated over and over again on the hour. And it's that repetition, I think, that really goes to lodge that information sort of deep inside the brain. I'm sure you probably can, that's my intuition of how it works. You probably know a little bit more science behind that, but
Yeah, there's also if we're talking about broadcast news, there's kind of contagion effects or spillover effects. So people trust the news, or at least they used to. So if you can get yourself into broadcast news, then there's this kind of rubbing off of the trust and engagement that people have with the news onto you if you can get into that channel.
yeah.
Um, I did read well, I didn't read it, but I remember a study showing that radio actually gets you the best bang for your buck in terms of advertising. It's seriously underpriced in terms of the effect that it can have. Um, and you talk about Chicken Tonight being very repetitive. I have great memories of that song. Maybe because it was in The Simpsons, I don't know. But yeah, very, very often used. Another example could be Go Compare, where they have the opera singer, and that was on in basically every ad break, and people really, really hated it. Um, but it worked. I mean, it grew their customer base enormously by like 20%, I think, because it used repetition, which is one of the best ways to form a memory in people's heads. So if you think of memory as kind of a spider web of interconnected ideas, so if you think of red, that activates red in your memory, but that also ripples out to things connected to red, like, for example, cherry or fire engine or whatever else. And so repetition of things, kind of like Pavlov with the bell and the food, the more they come together, or the more you encounter them, the stronger those connections get. So if, I don't know, you might connect banana with yellow in memory, but if you keep going to the shops and keep seeing bananas are green, then maybe through repetition that would change and you think of bananas as green. But repetition is one of those ways to strengthen things in memory, but there are other ways as well, like emotion. Of course, more emotional adverts and stories perform better, or novelty. So, I mean, we talk about news broadcasting. It's not called the olds, right? Nobody pays attention to things that everyone else already knows. We only pay attention to the most new, surprising, polarizing things, probably for the worse. But these are the things we pay attention to. And so I think if you're thinking about stories and audiovisual media, you need to be, yes, repetitive, but also emotional, surprising, and all of these other things which grab attention and get remembered as well.
And I guess that sort of sense of emotion can be much better portrayed using sound and image, much so than in the printed page. You know, one can see on the printed page, you can see a graphic, one can get a sense of emotion from that. But in a sense, that's a kind of two-dimensional emotion. But there's something that really hits you, I suppose, when you're listening to sounds of say a war situation, or you're watching information around, you know, a disaster or something good even, but that emotion could probably get to you in a much deeper way, I guess, using the power of audiovisual communication.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, because it's using dual coding, so it's going through multiple channels. It's more real, you know, it's more kind of naturalistic to how you would experience real life. So you empathetically experience it a bit more than if you're reading it, which makes it more abstract. And you can also be bombarded, as I said, with information with video. You're getting all of these millions of bits of information, I suppose, sensory, visual, audio from the video, and it kind of overwhelms you and allows the message to seep in uncritically.
So let's think a little bit more about some of these other hidden tricks as well. There's a book that you've written called Hooked, Revealing the Hidden Tricks of Memorable Marketing. It was published by Pearson in 2016. I think it's this kind of book that some of the people listening to this session would be really interested in reading more on about. Can you tell us some more about those hidden tricks, particularly as they relate to visual communication or marketing? I think it's important to know, even those of us that work in marketing and PR and so on, susceptible to the same kind of hidden tricks that perhaps we don't realize that
Oh yeah.
we're exposing our audiences to. I wondered if you could bring any flavor to that.
Yeah, we're all biased. We're all emotional and irrational, all of us. I have this question of who nudges the nudges. So even people who are designing nudges to influence the public, they themselves are irrational and biased and probably making all sorts of mistakes, but that's probably a different podcast. But as for the book, a really important principle, as I said, we're all biased, so we're all what's known as cognitive misers, meaning we all have very limited brain power for paying attention to the world and processing information. The universe is infinitely big. There's an infinite amount of information and choice out there. For example, you could spend your entire life dedicated to studying the brain of leeches, the structure of the brain, how it works. And by the end of your life, you probably will only know a fraction of everything there is to know about it. So there's infinite information out there, and our brains are tiny by comparison for dealing with it. And on the internet, on TV, etc., there's all these choices, and again, all this information. So how do we cope? Well, we can't pay attention to everything. There's all sorts of things that we miss. You may be aware of this experiment, the invisible gorilla experiment, where they essentially had people watching a video of some people playing basketball, and they had a person in a gorilla suit, a gorilla outfit, walk across the screen, and about half of people failed to notice the gorilla. Similarly, another study had people walk through a park and afterwards asked them, did you notice anything unusual? And about half of them failed to notice a clown on a unicycle. So we cannot pay attention to everything. But the flip side of that is there are certain things you will immediately pay attention to. So if you imagine you're at a noisy cocktail party, and imagine for the sake of argument, your name is Bob. There are dozens of people talking or dozens of conversations, there's music playing. And then across the room, you hear someone say to their friend, oh, I've never really cared for Bob. Your ears will pick up and you'll have heard that, even though you weren't listening to that person. And even though the word Bob comes at the end, you'll still hear the whole sentence. And this is called the cocktail party effect. And it's taken as evidence that your brain is processing everything around you at a very low level. So every conversation in that room, your brain is listening to at some level. And then your brain decides what you should pay your very limited conscious awareness to, like hearing your own name, for example. So there's a network in the brain that's been called the brain's bouncer that decides what information should be allowed into the very limited, exclusive space of conscious awareness. And this bouncer has a VIP list of things that you immediately pay attention to. So your own name being one of them. So personalization obviously works very well in UX and in stories. If you're talking about PR, it's hard obviously to personalize in that sense, but you can personalize to everyone if you use current affairs or celebrities or memes or popular songs. These are things that are personal to everyone and it's kind of at the top of everyone's minds. We also pay attention to emotion. If you see a moldy apple, you'll look at that before the others. Burger King used disgust quite well in their moldy Whopper campaign, which went very viral, so to speak. It was a picture of a Whopper that had gone moldy, activating disgust, making people look at it. It was also using surprise, which I'll talk about in a minute. Why would Burger King show a moldy burger? And that went very viral. It was shared and got a lot of buzz. I don't think it was a great idea because if we're thinking about associating things in memory, it's probably not a good idea to associate your food with mold in people's heads, but it was attention grabbing. So there's emotion. There's also primal things, what I call the 3 Fs of food, faces, and sex. Things we're immediately hardwired to pay attention to. Danger as well, a spider or a shark or an angry face we'll look at immediately. And then the final one is contrast, which I talked about, surprise, something jumping out or something being a different color to everything else, or something being creative and new and unusual. So if you have a bunch of green apples, you'll look at the red one before you look at the green one. So we tend to look at things that are different or distinctive to everything else. So those are on the brain's bouncers VIP list. So that's one of the tricks is to use these things like a cute puppy in an advert will do well because we're evolutionarily hardwired to pay attention to things that are like babies for obvious survival reasons. or fear or disgust or whatever it might be. The second trick is engaging people. So once you've got their attention, how do you keep them hooked and get them to actually digest your message? And partly that's about fluency, so making something as easy to digest as possible. So it could be using imagery or using video, like we've talked about, or using video and audio together, for example. But it's also the words that you use or the choice of imagery or content. So, for example, there's something called concreteness, where we tend to better process and better remember things that are concrete, by which I mean visualizable, simple, and things you encounter every day. So if you think about what a toddler's first words are, cheese, ball, horse, these kinds of things tend to do better than, say, string theory. So Trump is great at this. You know, he talks about building a wall rather than outlining a complex immigration policy, because a wall is literally a concrete, tangible thing that people can imagine, they can see in their mind's eye. So that's fluency. And then there's also a degree of curiosity, which engages people. So people hate to have things unresolved in their memory. So I was actually on a quiz show last year or the year before with my wife. I was trying to do one new thing for every day of the week as a kind of adventure. Sorry, for every week of the year. And going on a quiz show was one of these. And we actually lost because we didn't get a riddle. The show is called Ridiculous. It's all about riddles. And that riddle was found in a messy bedroom, I make minutes seem like hours. Any idea what that might be?
I'm thinking alarm clocks, but that's just too obvious, and it's not going to be typewriters and minutes from that point of view. I'm just doing shortcuts in my head now for the word minutes. That's probably not the clue.
Oh, you're along the right lines, actually, in how you're thinking. But anyway, so there's this kind of what's called cognitive dissonance when you don't know the answer to something.
Yeah.
Like right now, I'm not giving you the answer. You probably feel a bit annoyed and frustrated.
Yeah, I'm kind of like less able to even think of a third or
Right.
fourth suggestion.
So the answer was boredom, because boredom is an anagram of bedroom.
Oh, I never even thought of that. Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's a messy bedroom. But
Brilliant.
anyway, the point is, you know, you felt that dissonance, that tension when you didn't know the answer, and that's what curiosity is all about. Presenting people with a little bit of a puzzle, something that doesn't quite make sense, so that they go, hang on, what's this? And they become drawn in. It's how Netflix uses cliffhangers at the end of every episode to make you watch the next one, for example. Now, in messaging, clickbait headlines do this very well. Newspaper headlines that ask a question. They say 10 things to do on Valentine's Day. You won't believe what's at number 3. These kind of things to evoke your curiosity and get you engaged. So research has shown that emails are more likely to be opened if there's a question mark in the subject line, for example. And then the third thing is, I should say also, stories are very effective. We remember information better if it's a story rather than just a descriptive format. And so that's about empathetically experiencing information. But the third thing is, because we are cognitive misers, we can't think through everything carefully, rationally. So we tend to rely on heuristics instead, which are subconscious shortcuts or rules of thumb. So if you imagine being in a foreign city for one night for a business trip and you're looking for somewhere to eat, and you can only find 2 restaurants, one of them is completely packed and the other one is completely empty, which one would you go to?
Packed one.
Yeah. So when I ask this in presentations, like 99% of hands go up for the packed one, and they go up immediately, because if it's busy, it must be good. And so that's an example of a heuristic, which you're probably aware, called social proof. If everyone else is doing something, it must be the right thing to do, which generally it is, not always. I'm sure we can all think of examples in history, recent and otherwise, where doing what everyone else is doing probably not the right thing to do. But generally speaking, it serves us well. You know, if people are running down the street screaming, you should probably do that too. If you take time to figure out what's going on, it might not be good for your survival value. And there are all sorts of these heuristics, these shortcuts, which can influence behavior. So if you bake them into your story, your content, your messaging, whatever, you can influence the behavior that you desire. You know, if you want people to quit smoking, for example, or to start smoking, whatever you're trying to do, the way that you frame the message, the wording that you use, the nudges you incorporate, will make it more likely that people do that. So there's a very masterful example, a very skillful example from the NHS for the COVID vaccine campaign, where in just 19 words, they managed to fit 6 nudges at least. Those 19 words were, you have reached the top of the queue and are a priority for getting a free NHS COVID vaccine. So by saying there's a queue, they're using social proof. If it's popular and busy, it must be good. By saying you've reached the top, they're using commitment. So you feel invested and you don't want to lose your place in the queue you've been waiting in. By having you at the top and be a priority, it's potentially an ego appeal to make you feel special. Also, saying that you're a priority is using a nudge called scarcity, where you feel like demand is bigger than supply, so you feel this urgency to go and get it. Giving it for free is about making it as easy as possible, but also probably using reciprocity, where you feel a bit obligated to return the favor if you're being given something for free. And having it come from the NHS is using messenger effects, where we're more likely to comply with someone we like or trust, and people like and trust the NHS, or at least they used to. So it's a very skillful example of how to craft a message or a story using nudges to change behavior. But by and large, those are the 3 types of tricks. First of all, getting the brain's bounces VIP list and grab attention. Secondly, engage people through curiosity, making it easy and using stories. And then thirdly, frame the message in a way that's going to nudge behavior.
That's so insightful, particularly reflecting on that COVID example there. Amazing to understand probably the work that went into just putting together one simple message and realizing the extent that all of us, even when we do work in PR and marketing, may not have been aware of the level of crafting that had been going on just in those 19 or 20 words that you said. I think there's some really valuable tips there for those who may be about to appear on broadcast on TV or radio around the importance of delivering messages very simply and using some of those techniques to kind of get that message to cut through to audiences. We see so much evidence, I think, in corporate communications often of complex messages in jargon that mean something to that organization, perhaps don't mean anything to the journalist that they're trying to pitch it to, and certainly don't mean anything to the audience that they're trying to reach. So there's some really practical examples there. You say, Trump's example of build the wall and so on is actually talking about something much more deep and complex, but to boil it down into simple slogans like that can be a really effective way of communicating. So I really appreciate some of those tips. I hope some of the corporate communicators that are going to be listening to this session will take some of that on board. Perhaps they know it all already, but if they don't, I would recommend that they read your book as well, because it's probably all revealed there. So, I mean, that book was written 10 years ago. Audio-visual content has really moved on an awful lot since then. We've got social media, podcasts, YouTube's exploded. We've got data from Ofcom shows that the amount of time we're spending on these other types of audio-visual kind of communication tools are actually increasing. Less so perhaps on reading printed word and so on. So have you been able to sort of build on the research that you did for that book 10 years ago? What more have you learned in this kind of more recent era about the subliminal power of audio communications? Or did you just reveal it all in the answer to the previous question? Are you seeing other forms of audio visual communication such as podcasts and YouTube playing this same kind of impact that perhaps radio and TV were once so dominant in?
Well, one thing to say is that these principles are fairly hardwired, so they tend to have an evolutionary basis. You tend to find them in pretty much every culture around the world. Most people are going to instinctively look at a cute baby or a puppy, for example, because we're just hardwired to do it. So all that the technology has done in that sense is increase the scale and sophistication, but it's still the same techniques. What you can do now is get it in front of more people more often, and also test things and see if they work. I mean, that's been one of the big learnings for me, is that there's all these things which have great theory behind them, and they may work in some contexts, or they work in the laboratory, but you really need to test them and see if they if they do work. So I had a client recently, a supplements client, and we had a quick win for them, which was to remove the currency symbol from their pricing, because loads of research shows that if you do that, it feels less like money. Like you see in restaurants, they don't have the pound sign. It feels less like money and you're more likely to buy. And there's a fair few studies backing that up. And so we did that and we tested it. It actually had the opposite effect and their sales went down. And they weren't very happy, as you can probably imagine, but really you have to test things to see if they work or not. In this case, probably supplements is a category where trust is very important. And if you start visibly, explicitly kind of manipulating things like that, it may put people off, or it may have just simply been a geography issue where people were coming from other geographies outside that one, and so not seeing their currency may have confused them. So it's really important to test things, but all of this technology now makes that possible. That just wasn't really possible in the years before. You had to do manual testing. I used to work at a facial coding company where we'd measure people's facial expressions while they watched adverts and trailers. And before, in the old days, a researcher would have to watch a video of someone's face and stop it every frame and note down on a piece of paper how their muscles had changed on their face. But now that's obviously all automated and scalable. So there's amazing things happening there in terms of testing. But the main thing that I've seen since then is the ability for personalization. So not every nudge, not every message will work the same for every person. So as I said, authority, for example, being a nudge that's seen in cultures all around the world. So it's kind of hardwired in us to follow authority figures. But what an authority figure looks like in one part of the world would be very different to someone in another part of the world, or even within one country. You know, one segment might view authority figures in terms of doctors and scientists in lab coats, whereas for someone else, it might be an influencer or a religious leader or in fewer cases, a politician maybe. But what authority looks like is different for different people, but the underlying principle remains the same. And so the internet and all of these technological advances have really helped us to target different people and serve them different nudges and different kind of aesthetics, even tone of voice that's going to really work for them. And so that's what I've been mainly working on since then at Cambridge Analytica and beyond, is using data points to understand people psychologically. Like if they have lots of social media apps and they have their screen brightness turned up to full, they're more likely to be an extrovert. And so brighter colors, warmer colors, social proof nudges, etc., will be more effective for them. And we're also seeing what some people have called the balkanization of the internet, where people are increasingly going off into their different silos. If you look at, for example, Twitter or X versus Blue Sky or Reddit, these are two like completely different people who see the world in a completely different way. One group is at the trunk of the elephant and saying it's a snake. The other group is at the leg and saying it's a tree. You know, completely different bubbles of reality almost, which from a social point of view, probably not a good thing for any of us. But from a marketing point of view, it's great because you can really easily kind of customize your message and your tone of voice and your nudges based on the channel. So people who listen to Joe Rogan and Theo Von, they have a very specific kind of personality. And so if you're designing a message for them, you can really get specific for them and the kind of tone of voice they'll respond to best and the nudges that will be most persuasive. So I actually did some research. Those people, for example, much higher on openness and extroversion. So they're more kind of creative and fluid and outgoing and social. They value status more than kind of kindness, for example. They're nudged more by ego appeals rather than, say, commitment. So there's all of these insights that you can gather psychologically for people in these different channels, which can make you target your psychological approach.
I hadn't seen the fragmentation of our social media channels in such a positive light before, in the sense that it makes it much easier to target people because they're each now building into separate silos of personas. So that's a massive insight I'm going to take away from today as well.
You're welcome.
I mean, there's something also I think with perhaps podcasts and social video around this concept of authenticity or almost amateurish, perhaps if that's a word, amateurish. a lack of professionalism. And
Yeah.
does that also speak to perhaps some of the other trends that we've been seeing? You know, things like the Edelman Trust Barometer have been showing over time a decreasing level of trust in certain forms of media. Do you think that the way things are being presented to us in these new forms of media, these podcasts, are a reaction to that? And is that also saying something psychological about the state that we're in right now? I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, I don't listen to Joe Rogan, for example. I don't have any feelings about him. Seems like a nice guy. Um, don't really know. I don't listen, but I do find it strange how he's sometimes attacked for example, misinformation. For wherever I've seen clips, he's just kind of asking questions and having a chat. I think that's a real, both the benefit and the cost of those kind of formats is there's no quote unquote fact checking, which has all these problems anyway, but it's just people, normal people, just having a normal chat like you would with your mates. And that's very persuasive, actually, possibly more persuasive than the traditional way of doing things. I'm not sure that it's. So is your question, is that a reaction to declining trust in institutions?
Yeah, perhaps it is the increasing audiences that we're seeing for that type of content, possibly a sort of, I don't know, just a reaction against the the professionalism and shiny objectness of the national broadcasters, or the way things have gone before for 100 years. Is this kind of search for authenticity and the blokes around a sofa having a chat? Is it a knee-jerk reaction against everything that went before? I don't know. In response to our brains just thinking, well, I need something different. Perhaps I
Yeah.
don't trust this anymore. I'm going to maybe trust these guys just sitting at the pub having a drink together. Is there a
So
psychology behind that? I wondered.
yeah, in the last few years, you probably can imagine, you've probably been doing the same yourself. I've been kind of wondering what's going on. And so I've read quite a lot of books trying to figure it out. And a really good one that I'd recommend is called The Fourth Turning. And it's not super scientific, but it is very interesting and it seems to make sense on face value. And there are more scientific books looking at the same thing, like Ages of Discord, I believe, is a more scientific version, though I haven't read it. And what the fourth turning says is that society goes in cycles, and the cycle lasts about a human lifespan, which is about 100 years. And that cycle is like the seasons. It goes from spring to summer to autumn to winter. And so if you think on mainland Europe about 100 years ago, we were in a winter. And then, so that's conflict. It's essentially famine, pestilence, and war. So you have economic crash, the Great Depression at that time. You had the Spanish flu, and you had two world wars. So we've now, about 100 years later, we've had COVID. So we've only got the financial crash and the war to come, and then hopefully we should be moving out of winter and into spring. But one way of looking at it is like inflation. So it's all about trust, really. People trust something, exploitative people then exploit that trust. People stop trusting it, and they then look for a new thing to trust. So the most obvious example would be money, fiat currency, and inflation, which turns into hyperinflation as money is printed and it's given out to people for doing nothing. Because we trust money, we all trust, or until recently trust, that a pound is worth a pound. And if you work a certain amount of time and put effort in, you'll get paid a pound. And so we trusted that as a store of value. Then that was kind of exploited through, as I said, money printing, furlough, these kinds of things. And so now the pound doesn't really have the value that it has because it's been used in this way. And so the faith, the trust in the pound is falling. And what we'll probably need eventually is some kind of new paradigm to replace that one, because people don't trust it anymore. And that's probably where Bitcoin or gold-backed currency or Britcoin or something, a CBDC, will come in. But this is a very kind of predictable pattern. You saw it in Germany 100 years ago, where they had hyperinflation, which was sorted by a new currency being brought in. Other examples could be universities, not to get too political, but everyone trusted universities. Now universities, they say that men could get pregnant and all this stuff. And so people are not really trusting universities as much anymore. And so now we see an alternative coming. Trump University could be one example. There's also a growth in homeschooling, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what we're seeing with the media, again, people used to trust the BBC, for example, implicitly. That trust was kind of exploited, probably very sensational example might be Jimmy Savile, who basically exploited the fact that he works for the BBC, so people would implicitly trust him, so he could do all sorts of horrible things by exploiting that trust. People don't really trust the BBC anymore, certainly less than they used to, and so people are looking for alternative things, institutions to trust. So if we go back to the seasons, it's like we're in winter, the period of decay, where trust in these institutions is decaying. But soon we'll be getting into spring, where the green shoots of spring are coming through, and there are these new paradigms, these new ways of thinking that we'll be using instead. Of course, the cycle will go again. So in 100 years, maybe it's Joe Rogan and podcasts who people stop trusting, and something new comes along. But that, I think, is what's happening.
So spring's making me think of birdsong, and then that leads me on to the topic of music. I think there's some interesting insights there about the role that sort of music and peripheral sounds can be used in broadcasts. It can actually perhaps sometimes also convey a message in the subconscious. Can you expand any more about the use of music sometimes in our audio visual communications, background music? I mean, as a daughter of a mother who's hard of hearing, it's really annoying and causes you to always need to put the subtitles on to be able to follow the dialogue. But can you tell any more about the power of music in some of this, the films or the TV or the radio that we might listen to in again, shortcuts, I guess, is probably the way it works.
Yeah, music's very interesting. So it has a long association with mesmerism or hypnotism, kind of associations of mind control. If you think about satanic panic of the heavy metal in the 80s and Beatlemania, people going absolutely crazy for the Beatles, and more recently One Direction and all of this, there's this association of kind of mania and hysteria with and mind control with music, which in fair is probably a bit sensationalist, a bit overblown, but I think there is something to it in a couple of senses. One is that music itself, with or without lyrics, is pure emotion in a way. It's designed to tap into your emotions, major scales being sad, happy, sorry, minor scales being sad, tempo matching heartbeat, the average heartbeat, or being a bit faster than that to make you feel excited, or a bit slower than that to calm you down. So it really engages with you in a physiological, emotional way. But secondly, of course, the lyrics are crucial for their persuasive power. So the MK Ultra campaign, which you may have heard of by the CIA, which is not a conspiracy theory, it's a real kind of admitted thing that they did, where they tried to do mind control through all sorts of ways, including sensory deprivation and LSD, even hiring prostitutes to work their ways on subjects. But basically what MK Ultra was all about, if you get down to it, was breaking down people's conscious resistance and then implanting a message in there subconsciously once the resistance is worn down. So they might, for example, keep people in sensory deprivation or not let them sleep for 3 days so that people are not thinking straight, they're all kind of bamboozled. And then they would do what's called psychic driving. So they would get a message on a tape and they would just play it over and over and over again to the people until it got embedded in their subconscious, and that changed their beliefs because they adapted that statement as their own. And there is more experimental research kind of supporting this, more quote unquote credible research. For example, there's experimental research on something called the disrupt then reframe technique. Essentially, if you bamboozle people a little bit and then implant a persuasive message, they're more likely to believe it and take it on than if you don't bamboozle them first. But that's what it's all about. And so music's very good at that because the loud drums and the music kind of overwhelms your critical thinking. So you're more likely to accept the message that you're hearing. And with a chorus, it's being repeated. So that repetition makes it stick. It's also a chorus, which means it sounds like there's multiple people singing it. Usually there's a double or triple track with the artist where it's being played 3 times, 2 or 3 times on top of each other. So it sounds like multiple people, which you probably would accept more subconsciously because of the social proof heuristic. But the really fascinating thing that I realized is a lot of these songs obviously are catchy and they stick in your head using what's called earworms. But the fact that they stick in your head and they're catchy means that you are subconsciously repeating that message on loop. Even if you're not listening to the song, it's still kind of ringing around in your head. And so that message is going to stick.
It's taking me back to the Chicken Tonight advert.
Exactly, yeah.
Full circle. So in your book, Free Your Mind, you advise us not to watch TV in bed. Can you explain why one shouldn't do that?
Absolutely. So we're more likely to be influenced. We're more vulnerable to influence during certain states, in certain states. So Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, have this acronym HALT. These are the states in which you're most vulnerable to temptation, essentially. You're more likely to be influenced by the monkey in your back, so to speak. And the HALT means hungry, anxious, or angry, lonely, or tired. So these are the times when you're conscious critical resistance is lower. If you're really hungry, it's called ego depletion, you're more likely to be influenced. If you're under emotional stress, fear, anxiety, or anger, you're more likely to be influenced. Loneliness as well. And tiredness, obviously you have less energy to think things through carefully. I think it's reported that Hitler used to do his rallies at night because, as he said, the will of the people is less at night. They're less able to resist the messaging, so they're more likely to take it on board. That might be why there's a news at 10 p.m., which always seemed odd to me. But yeah, so at night, your brain is kind of functioning differently. You're not critically attending to the messages or thinking about them. You don't really have the energy or the brain power to do that. And so the messages just seep into your head more easily.
Well, yeah, it's definitely one. Again, going back to my mother, she always complains about how upset she feels when she watches the 10 o'clock news. I always say, just don't watch the 10 o'clock news, watch it at 6 p.m. or watch it at 1 p.m. So you've got another book coming up soon. It's called Tech Gods, How AI Reads and Shapes Your Mind. We've been talking a lot in the media intelligence industry around the power of AI in terms of what it's going to do, in terms of the content that we're going to have to process for our clients, in terms of the proliferation of written content and probably increasingly audio and visual content that's going to be out there affecting our brands that we work with and so on. I don't think that book's been published yet. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and perhaps give us a little flavour of what you might cover off there? Because again, that's another one we might want to be adding to our reading list.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm exploring how AI is becoming a new god, essentially, and there's various aspects to that. Well, there's 3 parts to the book specifically: omniscience, omnipotence, and transcendence. But omniscience is about how AI has all of this information on us, tracking data from all kinds of different sources, including biometrics from, for example, your Apple Watch. It could get your heart rate. It could get your eye movements potentially through eye tracking. All sorts of data is collected on us all of the time. And also predictive models can be built on top of that to predict things about you that you probably wouldn't want it to know and would be very surprised to know that it could know. So I was, for example, in a proof of concept study, I was able to predict what kind of adult content people like based on very innocuous data points like their media preferences, their what kind of books they like and music. So, for example, people who watch hentai were more likely to watch animated TV shows and foreign language films and to read science books. So it's kind of a funny, kooky example, but making a serious point that these AI will be able to read our minds in quite surprising ways. Then secondly, omnipotence is about how it will be all powerful. Yes, through targeted nudging, personalized persuasion, through really enhanced behavioral psychology techniques of nudging, but also the fact that it will have immense power, which we're kind of seeing the early stages of this now with people being unbanked or debanked for their political beliefs. The protesters, the truckers in Canada not being able to access their money. So there will be this enormous power that will come with these digital identities in the coming years, and AI will have that power. Essentially, it could stop you from buying groceries because you tweeted the wrong thing or you don't have the right medical history. And then the third part of the book is transcendence, which is about how AI is potentially taking us to a new plane of existence, the metaverse, which is, it sounds kooky, but it's kind of the invisible realm, the imagination realm. It's connecting all of our subconsciouses together, and also probably not the best parts. I mean, it's bringing the subconscious urges to the surface. So you go on Twitter, and it's like videos of people being eaten by alligators, or stoking a race war, or whatever. It's like fear and anger and lust, and all of the kind of worst parts of our psyches are being drawn together in what I call the cloud of darkness. It's all being kind of amalgamated in the cloud. And there's a lot showing that technology kind of has a hollowing out effect of people. It's kind of bringing along nihilism. It's disconnecting people from community, tradition. It's kind of a dissolving effect, like a reverse philosopher's stone. It's kind of dissolving boundaries between countries, between genders, between people. And that makes us more reactive. It makes us more, empty, really. And nature abhors a vacuum. And this is where the dangerous part comes in. There's this principle of something, again, it's kind of a kooky esoteric principle, but they're called egregores. But a more scientific way of thinking about it might be, people have talked about infodemics or mind viruses, but essentially when people have been emptied out by technology, then they can be filled up by ideas that come from this metaverse, from this invisible imagination realm. And that's where you might see like a mass hysteria or a mass formation, psychosis, these kinds of things taking people over, which in a kooky sense are coming from that other realm. So some people believe that technology is enabling demons to come into our realm. And so it's a bit a bit worrying that Trump called his AI thing Project Stargate. But I know we're getting into weird territory here. The book is scientific, but these are probably some of the more interesting ideas. But the point is that these technological changes and AI are bringing about kind of a spiritual revolution, I think, and perhaps not for the better. The fourth part of the book is called Resistance, and it's about how you can fight back and how actually it can potentially be a good thing. So AI can make our lives better in lots of different ways. So I just wanted to mention that rather than end on a very gloomy note.
No, I'm pleased you ended with resistance. And I think that part of it is just understanding how it works. So, I mean, today's been super insightful already, realizing, we've all succumbed to the messaging and the tricks that TV, broadcast, radio plays on us, audio, visual. Those of us that work in the industry, as much so as those that don't work in the industry. It's so fascinating to get your insights just from that psychological point of view as well, especially with all the interesting past work that you've done with big brands and with organisations such as Cambridge Analytica that did, played an important role, made some headlines of its own and was in the news too. There's some things that are kind of been an eye-opener for me. Some of the things I'm reflecting on from today's session is about the shortcuts. It's about the subliminal power. It's about the hidden tricks that I think we should all be mindful of, and perhaps if you work in communication, try and use more of if used for good, but be conscious of the ethical implications of doing so if used for perhaps more nefarious means. We've spoken about the power of repetition, all those kinds of things. Just these clever tricks that our mind plays with us. And then as we kind of look to the future, and you spoke a little bit about your upcoming book around AI, is just thinking about sort of where we're going. I think it's all interlinked. And I think that some of the tricks that were perhaps being used, particularly in our broadcast media, are soon going to be used at greater effect going forward in this new world of AI. And interesting to hear for good and for bad of where that could be going. We should be mindful of it always. So I really appreciate your time today, Patrick. It's really given us a different perspective on perhaps how we look at the media and the messages that are fed to us. And really thank you for spending some time with us today to explain it all.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.